So let me just touch on the first box about the excellent teachers box and I just wanted to call it out and be very clear about it. So there's a whole bunch of stuff about the practice of effective teaching and sort of some of the school level conditions for facilitating effective instruction. The task force that came, or the request that the superintendent establish a task force on teacher effectiveness out of the finance committee was less on practice, more on policy, and really sort of the financial conditions around that. Now, I just want to be clear. Is that part of this task force on box number 1?
So the way we've handled that is that what we are doing is pulling apart the practice and the practitioner. That we need to do both. We need to really clarify what good practice is and talk about it and be able to define it.
Right.
And talk about what the conditions are that support effective practitioners.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those are flexibility, autonomy, some of those are compensation, some of those are working. I get to work with colleagues, I have time, I get to stay current in the field. I've already gotten, like, it's not, it feeds into the practice, but it's like what it means for me to have efficacy.
Right.
And some of that is organizational, like getting paid on time, and if my paycheck is wrong, it's not my fault.
That's right.
So those are the kinds of things we have to fix structurally, but there's also a set of things that should be true for practitioners here. So we're going to keep pulling those two things apart in the context of the task force, and then have kind of working groups about both things, because they're not, we can pull them apart to talk about them, but they're not divorced from one another. You have to always say, in order, you take care of a practitioner in order to do this kind of practice. It's not you just do all these things so that people are happy. They have to be able to do this stuff.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So that's how we're thinking about the task force.
Okay, so let me just go one step further here.
Sure.
So in terms of specificity, so I understand that's perfect. The conditions for it, whether it's so there's some folks have an assumption that if we are able to have a significant increase in salary by the end of year 2, end of year 3, shortening up the salary scale, having good school level leadership, people who know effective instruction and can model, is not necessarily just the principal. It could be other colleagues, right? Either off campus or on campus. So that lends to maybe different roles for teachers or teacher leaders. The issue of, so the evaluation practice, and then this, and I know this is hot button, but the issue of if we had the full rank by everybody's standard that 75% of the teaching force by anybody's standard is highly effective in advancing students' academic abilities and achievement, then whether we have school closures or school consolidations, in many ways it wouldn't matter because it would be an effective teacher everywhere, right? But in a environment where that may not necessarily be the case, that a continuation, when we have consolidations or what have you, and layoffs are being hit in underperforming schools, in neighborhoods that don't have a lot of money, that is an institutional practice of racism and discrimination, in my opinion. And that has to be dealt with. And that's, we could only do so much at the local level, but the point being is that are those kinds of questions also a part of this task force? Those specific kinds of issues?
I think they have to be. And talking about interrupting these patterns, and some of the reason we put the data so explicitly about the life expectancy of African American children born in West Oakland, naming these broader patterns rather than just staying focused on California standards test.
Right.
We're talking about the kind of educators we need in Oakland and the expectations we should have for all educators, and that the kinds of schools we want. See, part of what we're still lacking, we don't have a definition of a great school.
Right.
And so we've fallen into a pattern of just closing schools that have the tiny enrollment, low API, and there's a couple of factors. We need to talk about what we're aspiring to and what we want our good schools to look like in every neighborhood. And it's unacceptable, because then you have a pattern. If you close that school, and then these kids who leave that school into the receiving school are high need, that school was barely hanging on, that was just a little bit better than the other school, then that school gets hit and starts to unravel. Oh, next thing you know, you close that school, and then you've laid waste to an entire infrastructure in a neighborhood that happens to be of color, low income, without a lot of other resource, high unemployment. So yeah, you structurally produce the inequity that you espouse to try to interrupt.
Right.
So we need to define what high-quality, effective schools look like around this purpose of social justice, around the same things we're talking about. And look, I have families come up to me and say, you know, if we get X teacher next year, we're leaving. You know, every principal right now is under siege about what families won't go to what teacher. Other teachers, when they have kids in the district, say, we all know this, but we need a community convention about, okay, administrators, families, teachers, what does it look like then? We better have better kick-ass professional development. We better talk about expectations. We have to have a different kind of discourse to get to the thing that you're talking about. That doesn't, I mean, this has been building. I mean, let's be clear. This is generations in the making. It will not be next year different. Over the next 5 years, it'll be fundamentally different if we start having this dialogue together and changing the conditions, changing our expectations, changing support, changing compensation. That has to all happen. It's not one and then the next, it's all of these. But if we don't define what good looks like, we'll all just keep hacking away. So that's really at the heart of this for me.
And how you get to good.
That's right.
Because
That's right.
part of it is, I mean, I think in our high schools, particularly the higher performing stuff, is we've got, you know, we have like a university system going on. It's a funneling and a screening system going on without being very explicit about it.
One other thing, you talked about leadership, and that's actually why, and it came out of this conversation, we talked about effective leader, and if you guys recall, there was an interesting debate from the former principal on our board president about it's more than just the principal. And so literally, number 2 is effective principals and leadership. And we embedded that idea that there are going to be multiple leaders in schools that have different roles, and leadership development needs to be a much different conversation rather than principal PD. And that could be tied to then a salary, a lattice schedule for teachers who are teacher leaders around content, but that's embedded in there.
So we will be talking about it
We have to, I think.
in both of those boxes.
Well, I think we have to engage the OEA leadership and
Right,
others, and
right.
and folks have mentioned, hey, if we really thought about, and this is kind of paying our own teachers who have extraordinary practice to do PD, release time, we embed that then and we build in a PD structure where if you come out of the classroom for 2 years, you go back into the classroom. We start building our own practitioners around the practice. And that's leadership.
Right.
And I
Exactly.
think that's where we have to get.
Okay, great.